had never actually, as far as I know, I had never taken an actual film course, but they hired me to teach this course anyway, because in those days there were so few people that had taken film courses, which are available only in UCLA and a half a dozen other places, that it was impractical to require them to have taken a film course. Well, I have gone through, that was in 1974, I believe I started teaching that course. It still exists, but 3 other people have taught it by now, and it is not recognizable as the same course that I taught. But we devoted entire 5 weeks of a 3 hours a week course to a shot analysis of Citizen Kane, stopping after virtually every shot and analyzing the position of people on the screen and the costuming and the lighting and everything we could think of that seemed relevant. Since then, I found out that most of this stuff, or at least an awful lot of the stuff that was very important, we didn't realize was relevant because we didn't know what was going on. The man who I was co-teaching it with for a while said that there is not probably a shot in Citizen Kane that does not involve special effects.
I still consider Orson Welles to be the greatest director ever. Hitchcock is my second favorite, but Orson Welles, I think, is because Orson Welles changed filmmaking. D.W. Griffith made The Birth of a Nation way back in the day, and I used to be ashamed to run this in class because it's a very racist film. But because it's about the Civil War and the aftermath and Reconstruction and all that, very denigrating toward African Americans and so on. But at the same time, he made an epic feature, and this was the first time, and that changed filmmaking a lot from what it had been, which were these little shorts that they would run on. A Great Train Robbery, a little Western that ran 10 minutes or something like what I was doing in high school. He made this long feature that was epic in nature, and it explored all sorts of editing techniques and what have you. Well, then if you watch movies from through the silent era, the next big change was sound, which was just a technical thing. But the movies themselves actually got more stilted with sound because of the problems that they had with the film camera making so much noise and microphone placement and that sort of thing. So if you look at movies they got smoother and the editing got better and what have you as they went along, certainly, with filmmaking during the 30s. But if you look at movies in the 30s, they tend to all be the same. We have a cover shot of the whole scene. We shoot long shots, medium shots, and close-ups of everybody for the whole scene, and then the editor goes through and kind of picks out what they want to put together, and that's that. And it's a very stilted sort of formulaic filmmaking. Along comes Orson Welles and says, well, we never see ceilings in these rooms. So he started building ceilings in the set, and you didn't do it in Hollywood because that's where you had the lights coming down. But he did it anyway. He dug a hole in the floor and shot upward at a high angle so you could see the ceiling. He had extreme close-ups that opens up with Rosebud and the little globe, snow globe, in this huge thing filming the screen, and then Orson Welles' lips only on the whole screen saying Rosebud, and there's an editing sequence in that film where he gets married, and in about 60 or 90 seconds, just through a montage of editing, they show you the marriage falling apart just by watching them at the breakfast table. It's an incredible thing. So he changed filmmaking tremendously there. And when I ran this in classes, like in the 60s and 70s and 80s on up, why kids would say, well, what's so unique about this? We see movies like this all the time. I said, yeah, he invented it. You know, so technically, films have obviously changed a lot over the years, but those two guys really are the ones who made the significant changes in film.
I still judge by movies by the standards of 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, when you were expected to have a coherent plot with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and one story, and a hero, and a consistent theme all the way through. And that every scene contributed to the development of the characterization, the story, and the theme. I still expect that in movies. They don't even attempt that anymore in movies. When they're not dealing with superheroes and special effects and other comic book material, they are dealing with the world in the way that I think people see it now. They see it as an infinitely complicated series of relatively unrelated events, some of which occur in Zambubu land and plot thicknick and so on, and places like that they never heard of before. But they know that their lives are influenced by those. They also know that there is no such thing as a beginning or an end. There is only continual change. Everything developed not from a static situation, from a situation that was already developing.
So I'm an old movie fan. I grew up on old movies. So I've kind of become a curmudgeon about new cinema. My opinion is that new cinema has been too greatly affected by the visuals only approach. And I think that goes back to maybe MTV, kind of an MTV generation. There are a lot of films that I can't really get through because they have 1,700 edits in the first 2 minutes. And it's just a bombardment of information on my brain. And I've noticed that I don't really do well with that. And maybe it's my age, maybe it's my generation. So I think that story, moving at a nice, easy pace, stronger character development, not worrying about so much on the visuals to hook people in, but the story itself. I think we've lost some of that. You compare screenplays. New screenplays, the lead characters have very little to say. You grab screenplays from 50, 60 years ago, it's a much bigger difference. It's a bigger difference in those. So some of the movies that I really like The Maltese Falcons and The Big Sleeps and Casablancas and All About Eves, I'm afraid we're not going to see much of that, where it's so much in the character development and the verbiage, what they're saying. Some of those screenplays to me are just wonderful because of actually being poetic the way that they're written. And I don't get the same vibe from modern cinema. Now there's some I like. I mean, there's some I think that are trying to push themselves into that, but it's not necessarily mainstream.
When I started teaching back in the 60s, things were moving fast enough that one generation could not communicate well with another generation. By the time I retired in 1997, the graduating class with a BA after 4 years could not communication well with the incoming freshmen, because in that 4 years, the internet had developed, or the home computer had developed, or something like that. And as a result, the motion picture nowadays, I don't know what they're attempting to do. I don't know how to judge, well, comedy. I don't try to review comedies, because what I find funny, other people don't find funny, and what they think is hilarious look to me like rather normal living. I mean, the world is full of peculiar people. At least my world has always been full of peculiar people. I think if you get to know any single group, you'll find they are rather peculiar people. The norm doesn't exist.
I have to tell you that I'm pretty tired of superheroes. And once in a while, a film will come out, but I think mostly I like the independent type films. If we're not talking about foreign films, which I also like a whole lot. But independent films are the ones that really tell true stories about people in this country or anywhere. You know, they're sort of universal. All of this stuff with super special effects, and some of it is great, no question, but it really doesn't relate to the culture in the best sort of way, I think. And I'm very fond of Thor, you know, all those Thor things, and I don't know why. That's the only one that gets through with me. But all this sort of Batman and Spider-Man, although I hear that the animated one is great fun, and I think if it comes around, I shall go to that, or if it comes to cable. But I'm not going to spend money on it. But there is just too much of that, and not really enough real stories about people in all sorts of unusual phases that life can take you, and that's the best stuff. And I even like westerns, because westerns that are being made now are so much, well, they've updated themselves, or they've turned into things like Star Wars, which I have to confess I have a real fondness for Star Wars. And Star Trek has always been, you know, it's really the new Western. You know, you've got people chasing each other around the galaxy, and bad guys and good guys. This stuff can be great, but the whole thing is scripts. If you get something like Star Wars, the scripts are great. I mean, you know, there's character development, there's all kinds of wonderful things going on. But a lot of the superhero stuff really kind of loses that. You're sitting there waiting for character development, and then there's a huge explosion, you know, or some car chases.
The movies, as a result, rely on strong individual scenes. They make awfully good individual scenes nowadays. They do extremely well with acting on individual scenes, as long as the character doesn't have to develop. And they do extremely well on action and special effects and so on. But they don't make movies that are a unit, even as long as the old standard movies were about an hour and a half long. 2-hour long movie like The Grapes of Wrath was considered an epic. Nowadays, 2 hours is almost a minimum for a movie that intends to be taken seriously. The ones that are shorter than that are usually shorter because of budget, not because of intention.
I do not like these slasher movies, and I teach college, and my students go to them, and there's Chucky. Oh, Chucky scares me to death, and this friend of mine brought in a life-size Chucky doll, and I went crazy. Those films are very, very scary. But what I like is I'm a multiculturalist, and we're having more movies done by African Americans. And Tyler Perry in Atlanta has his own studio, and we have the Housewives. I mean, it's a Housewives. It's called the Housewives of Atlanta, and it's about rich African American women who don't need their men. They just have this money, and I think it's groundbreaking. I know it's a housewife thing, but it's groundbreaking, and I really want to write a paper on that. But I'm so glad, and I like the multiculturalism, and I hope I have a couple of students who are Asian, and he hopes that we do more films. I meant, you know, the universe, that we do more Asian films, use Asian people. But now this doesn't have anything to do with film, but the play Hamilton. The play Hamilton has every nationality you want. I mean, George Washington is played by an African American, and now in theater, in Broadway, they're mixing it up. They're finally, and guess who's out of work? The white actors. So it's bizarre.
And I don't know what the movies are attempting to do now, except that they are giving you a certain amount of action, a lot of not what we would call plot. Well, I guess you'd simply have to call it acting. Something is going on all the time, but something is going on the screen now may have no connection with what was going on the screen 20 minutes ago. I've forgotten the name of the title of it. I have no memory at all anymore either. But a movie I saw started off as being quite an effective satire on telemarketing and wound up as sort of an imitation of the island of Dr. Moreau with a man who was changing people into horses. The two are not closely connected, but I don't recall any review that I read that condemned that movie as being disjointed or a collection of fragments of various genres, but that's what the movies are now.
If we want to look back at how American movies have changed, I think it's a little bit too big of a question to go back through the entire history. But if we look at recent developments, something that I find very encouraging is that we are much more, or are working to be much more inclusive regarding who is able to make films. Some part of that is technology and people able to make films in their basements for cheaper, but also we are recognizing that minority voices, women's voices, have not been heard throughout 98% of the history of American filmmaking. We have someone like Oscar Michaud back in the silent era who made films starring African Americans for African American audiences, but that's not a regular occurrence, and we are now finally seeing black voices being represented, Latino voices being represented. Women, we still need to work on that. This past year, there were many genuinely great films made by women, but there were not very many films in the larger sense made by women. It was one of the worst years ever for women making movies, and that's something that needs to be rectified. But we are seeing people try to change that, and that mirrors the reckoning we're having in society with how we have treated minority voices and women's voices in the larger sense throughout history. And so I'm encouraged by the direction we're moving in, but we still have a long way to go.
I saw what was it? The Easy Rider the other day. Even more than when it first came out. That looked like a connection of fragments. The one thing it had to do that held it together more or less was at the time it included the kind of fragments, the desert colonies and the communes and so on, that were quite commonly commented as being reality at the world. I find it seems rather irrelevant now because that's not the kind of fragmentation society is involving now. It is still involved with fragmentation. It still should be involved with something relevant to our lives, but it doesn't seem to be. And I've talked to others of my generation, or roughly, there aren't many people of my generation around. I'm 87. Almost all the world is dead of my generation. They're all gone. They won't let me use the word here, or I would say they have turned into worm shit long ago. But I'm not going to say that because they'll cut it out. You'll notice you didn't hear it, did you? No, you didn't.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think they do reflect the times a little bit, and you can see it was a big explosion when color came on, and you can almost look at a film now, an old film, and come pretty close to identifying at least the decade that it may have been made in, from either the automobile styles or the hairstyles or the clothing styles or whatever else. So there's that. But also over time, as technology advanced, clearly the ability to do various special effects also, it continues to evolve, and I think we're also in a digital age now where people want immediate gratification. They can pull out the little phones and they can watch trailers, or they can watch films, or whatever they want to do. Everything's so immediate right now that I think that also changes how we communicate and how we tell stories. And I think it's still evolving.
And as a result, I don't know what the motion picture is trying to do, and as a result, I don't know whether it's succeeding. Anything should be judged, largely at least, on the basis of what it's attempting, and I no longer know what the motion picture is attempting. I can only analyze, really, the fact that it is failing to do what I'm looking for, and that's not much of a criticism because they had no intention of doing that in the first place. It's a reflection, in a way, of the way we see the world. We used to think it was simple.
The demise of the Hayes office, Hays as opposed to Hayes, so it's not my fault. But where the old straw, you've heard this, of when you show a bedroom with men and women, why they have twin beds if they're married, and if there's just one bed, why the man always has to have 1 foot on the floor, sort of thing. And the language, they had to fight and fight and fight in 1939 to get Frankly Scarlet, I don't give a damn, to get that damn in there. They really did. They went around and around and around about that, and finally they allowed it. Language had a lot of euphemisms in it. One of the things that modern day films, you see a lot of sex and people tearing each other's clothes off and stuff. Look at Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and it's sexier than anything you're seeing now just by how they look at each other. And some of the things they say to each other that are so much innuendo, but they're sexier because they're leaving more to your imagination, really. And this is something that has really changed, because in the 60s then, why things started loosening up in terms of what were we going to allow. And the main reason this happened was because television was giving you movies in your house. So how do we change this? And they said, well, we have to get more adult with this. And so this is one of the major changes, is the fact that we started allowing more graphic language. We started allowing more graphic photography or scenes and violence. And so this has been a big change. I talk about horror films because I am a big horror film fan, and I talk about the old Hammer films. The old Hammer films were the first monster films in color, Frankenstein and Dracula and what have you in color. Horror of Dracula is my all-time favorite film for horror films because atmosphere. It has some gore in it and some blood and what have you, but it's atmosphere. And so many, it's creepy to watch it. Whereas with a lot of more modern horror films, it's just how much gore can we show, and is there a new way to chop somebody's head off or something. Now, this is not to say Halloween, I think, is a fantastic film. The first Nightmare on Elm Street was a fantastic film. Very innovative, very creative. And these are when these people were making these films with no money.
They make movies that are that fine. Even 12 Angry Men, 12 men sitting around at a bare tabletop on wooden chairs talking. Well, that's what the movie is about, really. It's what life is about to a large extent. People talking to each other one-on-one. I don't suppose anybody's ever done a study, but I keep wondering what percentage of footage in the mass movies of the world consists of two people talking to each other. Nowadays, one of them's got to be talking to either a computer screen or a robot, or they will figure it's not filmable. I don't know.
Technically, it's changed. It's evolved to the point where anybody can make a film. You can shoot it on your phone if you want. Steven Soderbergh is shooting movies on iPhones. So I think it's just from a technical standpoint, it's made it possible for anybody to pursue filmmaking. And in that regard, I think filmmakers have sort of embraced technology. Like I said, Steven Soderbergh is shooting movies on iPhones. So I think, just from a technical standpoint, it's changed dramatically. I mean, hardly anyone shoots on film anymore. I mean, you still can, and studios still do, but I don't think there's a need to anymore, not like there was before. And there was kind of a snootiness that came with it. It's like, oh, I'm only going to shoot on film or whatever. But I think that's kind of changed because of the creativity that you can have with shooting digital and being all digital. But as far as storytelling, it's evolved a lot, but I don't think it's gotten better or worse. For me, I think the 70s were, like the heyday of cinema, and I think we're still trying to live up to that, yeah, I think it's evolving. The stories are changing, but I think it's all for the better.
In a sense, I started teaching film when it was still possible to teach film. I don't know how you teach it now. End of speech.